This podcast is recorded on stolen and unceded Aboriginal land.
We acknowledge the First Nations and elders of this country, and we join their calls for justice.
Superannuation califragilisticexpialidocious.
This is why you weren't involved. Hello, everyone. I hope you're enjoying 2023 thus far. Tom and Emerald here. We're still taking a little bit of a break. We've been bringing you episodes that we've sort of banked for a little while. And Emerald, you're on holidays right now.
Yeah.
Are you having fun?
I'm driving across the countryside.
And New Zealand. Oh, look at that, eh?
That's a choice.
That's pretty is. So we are unlocking this episode that we released for Patreon. This is me talking to Rob Lechte, aka DJ Robstep, aka Wheel Inventor on Twitter. A fascinating, in-depth analysis of how fucked the superannuation system is, why it's bad, how it works, and all the problems with it, and the great campaign that Rob runs, Workers Against Super. You've listened to this episode. Emerald, what were your thoughts?
Well, look, maybe I'll listen to it now. I'm going to listen to it now that it's unlocked. I'm still deciding whether I want to chip in $3 a month to be a patron. My mum, I will say, this is one of my mum's favorite episodes. She listened to it and she said it was very, very good. And everyone should listen to it. So
you'll see it is long, and I know it's like about a boring thing, but please keep listening because it's really crazy important. It's insane how much money and how much power superannuation represents and how you should know about it whether you're old or young or on the left or the right. Why are you listening to this?
Impress your friends with your encyclopedic knowledge of the superannuation system in Australia.
Fuck yeah. All right, enjoy everyone. See you soon, Emerald.
Bye.
Serious danger in Australia.
Hello, patrons. Bonus content of this Serious Danger, this podcast we have about Greens politics in Australia. Just Tom here for this one. Emerald's busy doing other stuff. Too boring. She thinks superannuation is too boring. No, that's not true. It's just me and our wonderful guest. This is not an official Greens Party podcast. It is made possible with the help of the Green Institute and our awesome producer, Michael the Griffin. This is a special treat, bonus content for you, dear people, who very kindly support us on Patreon. Thank you for doing that. You help us keep the lights on. You help us make this stuff happen. Thank you for supporting the show. Thank you to people who have bumped up and edited their pledge and given us more money. We appreciate it. Eventually, we will have a system in which your Serious Danger patronage will be about 10.5% of your wage and will be garnished into a fund for Serious Danger. Now, don't stop listening because we are talking about superannuation, and I know it's extremely fucking boring. And particularly if you're a young person, you don't want to think about it. It's a nightmare and there's forms and it's very boring. But Australia's superannuation system is like an extremely important part of the political economy of Australia. It's important for our retirement system, for our grandparents and parents, our boomer parents, exes, for our own retirement, for social solidarity. And you really do need to understand it because it's fucking massive. It is 30 years this year since the Keating government introduced the compulsory universal super guarantee. Super assets are now worth $3.3 trillion fucking dollars. The Australian Stock Exchange worth about 1.9 trillion. Okay, so you could buy the entire stock market with super assets and still have $1 trillion left over. You always hear Labor and Paul Keating and the union movement banging on about the super system as one of the greatest achievements ever of that era and one of the best parts about the Australian welfare state or the way that we run Australia. You hear plenty of crazy right-wingers critique it too, like batshit people like Tim Wilson and Andrew Bagg, and the Liberals and Conservatives are constantly trying to attack and undermine it. You very rarely hear the Greens talk about it, and we very rarely hear a left-wing critique of the super system. But it is actually very bad.
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, this House last night passed the superannuation guarantee levy. In doing so, it has entrenched in legislation a great reform which will be of great benefit to coming generations of Australians.
What if I told you that super was actually bad? And to talk more about that, I have an amazing guest joining us for this episode. Rob Lechte is a welfare state advocate. You may know him on Twitter at DJ Robstep. He has an incredible ability to turn any conversation into a critique of the superannuation system and replying. He's an ultimate super reply guy across the board. He's very good at that. And you can check out his work at djrobstep.com. He's written about this stuff for Jacobin magazine and has a new campaign launching on this topic, which will be very, very relevant. Rob, welcome. It is lovely to meet you. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks, Tom. It's great to be here.
Is that how you spend your days on Twitter? Just just trolling and searching for people saying positive things about super so you can get in there and set them straight?
It's sadly close to the truth.
Does that make you happy? Or do you feel like you're doing God's work there?
It's all very automatic because I know the args very well, so I can win effortlessly, and so it doesn't actually take too much time or effort or thinking.
Love to win. I would highly recommend checking out this piece that Rob wrote for Jacobin a little while ago. It's called Australia's Superannuation System Enshrines Inequality. A little bit of background for you, just really briefly, Rob. Who are you? Who is Rob Lechte? And how did you find yourself coming to write about and think about this so much? Why is this particular political issue and part of Australian political economy important to you?
I guess it all started when I moved to Australia about 5 years ago. Before that, I'd never heard of superannuation, and I moved over here for work. I had to sign the form that they give you when you get a new job and choose a superannuation fund. It all seemed like a little bit of a silly privatised system. It's like picking an insurer. You can't possibly make an informed choice, and so you just pick a random fund. And it all seemed a bit silly, really. But I always thought that I'd just want a pension when I retire, and the government should really just take care of that. So I kind of signed the form anyway, and didn't think too much about it. And then I started talking to Labor adjacent people, and they all seemed to think that this was a great system. So I imagined that there must be something super progressive about it. Like, does it have an element of redistribution? Like, is it a safety net for people who don't earn much throughout their lives? And then turned out it wasn't. Perhaps it does something good for preventing inheritances. Like maybe it goes back into a common pool of ownership once you die. It turns out it doesn't do that.
No, it doesn't do that.
And so, yeah, does it smooth income well? Turns out it doesn't do that. And so,
no, it doesn't do that.
I wondered what the actual progressive element about it was, and why the Labor Party and in particular the union movement spent so much time supporting it. And this was fascinating to me, and I guess not growing up in Australia and not growing up with the cultural baggage of superannuation being this looming omnipresent institution allowed me to see it with somewhat fresh eyes. And so I found this fascinating because it really seemed like an example of culture eclipsing politics. Because the Labor Party did it and they're nominally union aligned, the Labor movement feels like they have to support it. And I think no one's like, all that happens because of all that happens for cultural reasons. I don't think anyone's taking a step back and looking at whether it achieves any anti-poverty goals or redistributive goals. People are just, oh yeah, the guy with the red tie did it, so it must be good. Let's keep supporting it. And it's a real enigma, and I've never I found that fascinating to this day, and I guess that's why I started writing about it and tweeting about it.
All right, now let's briefly, if we can, roll over the basics to the point that all the information that people should basically know about how this thing got set up. I suppose the origins of super, as we say, 30 years since the compulsory superannuation guarantee was legislated by the Keating government in 1992. What should people know just like before that, or what was the case for superannuation prior to that in the 80s, and how did this system come about? What's the thinking behind it?
So before that, there were retirement funds and superannuation funds, but they were pretty sporadic, I guess, and often they were directly tied to the employer. So if you worked at a company and then left, your super would you would lose your super, and so that was
including getting fired, right? So your boss could fire you, and your pension, like super money, they just kept that. So it was like a bonus for firing your employees. You got to keep their fucking retirement savings. Amazing.
That's right, but it was also seen as a bit of a fancy people's perk, and only more well-to-do folks got super, and so it was decided to expand it, and that culminated in Kelty and Keating's master plan to set up the superannuation guarantee, which essentially broadened it to basically every employee, but also set in place an increasing percentage scale where more and more of your wages over time starting from, I think, around 3%, which has grown into around 10.5% today, and legislated to hit 12% in 2025, I believe. So more and more of our wages are being shoveled into this thing. I mean, at the time, there was it was a very different time to now economically, but there was this common thread of inflation being a thing that people were worried about. And I think in the context of that time, the union movement agreed to it because it was a way for workers to still get some gains and put a little aside, but with less inflationary pressure because they couldn't immediately spend that money. They could only spend it down the track, and that might have been a reasonable measure at the time, but since then, it has grown and grown and gone far beyond that brief and turned into this gargantuan economic institution whose purpose is unclear.
Question mark? Yes. I think the Morrison government want to actually legislate the purpose of super, which got a bit of pushback and stuff, which, could actually be a reasonable thing to do to figure out what the fuck this trillions of dollars is for. I think a couple of things to say just about that initial period. So we had this the pension system. That is, there have been pensions in Australia since like 1908. Now they were very specific. Sometimes they were just widows' pensions. After the war, is a big part of the welfare state is providing pensions, particularly for widows. And there was this, pension measure, which is a direct payment to elderly people to get them through retirement. It was often extremely stingy and means tested. Okay, so it wasn't universal, didn't go to everybody. And so there's a perfectly legitimate concern from workers that retirement would be hell and you'd be eating cat food until you die, and it would be a miserable experience. And it's no wonder that lots of working people and unions fought for a more just retirement through superannuation funds. That was the way they did it. And so often unions would win these accounts on the shop floor and would have to have employer contributions to put away for their retirement when they leave their job. And I think it'd be fair to say that we believe generally in the idea that bosses, capital, should have to have obligations to looking after the retirement of people in their old age and workers as they retire, right? That's a good progressive left-wing general idea that's sort of the bedrock of what we're playing with here. Is that fair to say?
That's right. And even today, the pension is pretty miserly. A lot of people are worried about languishing on the pension, and justifiably so. If you look at the living standards documents that these super funds put out, they'll describe the kind of living conditions of what it's like on the pension, and it's usually like not being able to fix your car straight away, maybe fixing a leaky roof occasionally, only being able to go for a day trip in your own town and not really being able to go on holiday. So it's certainly not a luxurious standard of living. And in particular, if you haven't been fortunate enough to have a house and have it paid off by the time you hit retirement, the pension is simply not enough to keep you out of poverty. And so people, particularly women living alone who are renters, they're in widespread financial stress because the pension is simply not enough. And that's why people look to super and worry so much about it, because they feel that without it, they will languish on the pension, and correctly so.
Yeah. And it's that conception of the pension, which is really rooted in setting super up, right? That Keating regularly refers to the pension as an anti-destitution measure. Okay, so in the neoliberal mind, that's what the pension is. It's like a last resort. It's welfare, which of course is the worst thing in the world to a whole bunch of people in the Labor Party. Like, that's terrible. That's charity or whatever. Like, it's something to be disregarded, or something that you should only go onto if you absolutely need it. It should be targeted. That's very important to people, as opposed to a different concept of the pension, which I think we might get to in a little bit. But it's important just, I think, to identify that idea that, the pension is this sort of emergency kind of payment that's there, that's just about you being able to subsist in retirement, as opposed to living a good, decent life with dignity, supported by the state because you've worked your entire fucking life, and that's what you deserve as a human being. Yeah,
but Keating regularly describes it as languishing on the pension. However, it's worth noting that the pension is, for most retirees, by far the most important source of their income. So I think the median retiree, 80% of their income is from the pension, and so even at its current levels, it's still critically important.
Yeah. Do you have strong opinions about, whether super was introduced to replace the pension? Because Keating certainly says that's not the case. It was there to supplement the pension. There's been a few articles. Again, this would come down to the purpose of super, whether we are actually entirely privatising the system and have a future Australia one day in which no one's on the pension, everyone lives off their super, or whether it's supposed to supplement it or what have you. What do you think about that?
Well, I think when it started off, it seems like from if you trust the recollection of Bill Kelty and Paul Keating, it seems like they were more interested in building up this pool of investment capital, and its effectiveness of a retirement system was really by the by, because if your goal was simply to keep retirees out of poverty, you would simply bump the pension. If your goal was to pool risk, you would share retirement funds collectively. You wouldn't create individual accounts. So I don't think effectiveness as a retirement system was the motivator at all. Maybe at the start it was a nice little extra on top of what you might get ordinarily as part of your retirement income. But the fact that it's grown from a small percentage up to 10% and growing to 15% and become a pool of $3 trillion of wealth. And that's obviously going to undermine the pension and the pension's role as this kind of universal bedrock of retiree incomes. So at the scale that it's in, it's inevitable that it's going to heavily undermine the pension. And in terms of attention alone, in the economic pages of the media, super gets a tremendous amount of attention. Labor and the union movement spend a lot of time talking about it, and the time we talk about that is less time talking about universal welfare. So we seem to talk about super a lot more than where the pension is at or what the pension age is, even though both of those things are much more relevant to the plight of your average retiree.
Yeah. Another misconception I think that really does go to the setting up of the original super guarantee is where this money comes from, where your super contributions come from. Because I think if you're a millennial or younger, and I was talking about this with my sister-in-law the other day too, what we can see of super to be, and when you go for a job, it'll say wages and super on top or whatever. So we don't associate the super contribution with our wages necessarily, and it's often presented as employer contributions. It's something that the employer pays on top of the wage bill. Now, that's really not accurate, okay? This is coming out of your wages, and when the first guarantee was introduced, that was 3% of a 6% wage rise that was coming out of workers' pay packet that went into the super, okay? So if they hadn't had the super guarantee wages, they would have got the 6% pay rise, okay? But it was deliberately put into super accounts. So that's money that is deferred wages, right? And as the super guarantee goes up, overwhelmingly, that does work out to be something of a wage increase to workers who are disempowered and aren't able to get a wage increase generally. So you can sort of see how it kind of, I guess, grows the overall wage bill over time. But it's important to say, like, it's not like the boss paying a fee on top of your wage. It is, from the boss's point of view, part of the entire wage bill. Have I explained that clearly?
Yeah, I think so. There's been a concerted effort by Keating and co. to give this impression that it's actually this kind of magic free extra money on top of your wage. But of course, from the employer's perspective, they don't care. Like, they have their total wage bill and they pay your normal wages into your normal account and your super into your super account, and they set their wages accordingly. So wages are set by your overall wages is obviously determined by bargaining power, and so the more of your overall compensation goes into super, that's money that they could have put in your ordinary bank account, but they didn't. And so your spendable income or your take-home pay lowers because of that. Obviously, if you were able to withdraw from your super account or have your super paid directly into your bank account, your spendable income would be much higher throughout your working life. And for some people, maybe that's worth it. They might have saved that money anyway, and they will get a higher quality of life in retirement. But it's a trade-off. It's a consumption shifting scheme. Super's goal is to deliberately make all workers poorer or lower their spendable income and shift that consumption into retirement, ostensibly in the hope that it raises living standards. But it's not, nothing in life is free. There's no magic money that falls from the sky. Keating's not a god. It's purely it's purely trade-offs between before retirement and after retirement. And super's a saving scheme, and the basic concept of saving is that a dollar saved is a dollar not spent, and you could have spent that dollar on food and shelter, but you didn't. You were forced to put it away and spend it on food and shelter down the track in many years' time when you're older.
Now, I think you can make that point, but also agree with the point that some have made. So some would say that if we don't increase the super guarantee, workers will get nothing, right? And there is, I think, evidence to say, well, Abbott froze the super guarantee in 2014 and wages have still stagnated. That is, bosses will not increase wages magically. If we didn't have the super guarantee, it's not like they would increase wages commensurate to how much they would be paying if the super guarantee was legislated. So, of course, bosses, capital, want to pay wages as little money as possible. That's the game. That's class war, baby. That's how it works. So in a time of extremely low bargaining power, you could, I think it is necessarily true to say that increases to the super guarantee for some workers will be the only increase to the overall wage bill than they'd otherwise get. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, raising the super guarantee can certainly provide a temporary bump, but the consensus from the wonks is that in the long term, that bump will simply be compensated for later by deferring a pay rise that you might have gotten. And so, like I say, overall wages are determined by bargaining power. There's nothing magic about the super guarantee in terms of raising bargaining power. You might get a short-term bump if it's written into your contract. Then you go and apply for your next job, and it's the same underlying conditions of bargaining power, and your wages will be set at the same level, except you'll have just marginally less to spend because more and more of it is being put in your super account.
Yes, it is certainly true that there have been cases of some employers. So the super guarantee goes up, and the employers mean, okay, that's less take-home pay for you. So your overall wage isn't going up. It's just that more of your take-home pay is going to be reduced so that we can meet this super guarantee. Now, that's not across the board, and I'm sure whatever it does happen, that's extremely unpopular and it's not great. But as you say, with low bargaining power, some workers have no choice but to accept that deal. And so, they just get less take-home pay, more of their money going into retirement, which won't affect them for 40 fucking years. And when you've got things like a cost of living crisis, when housing's so expensive, et cetera, that's a pretty shitty deal for workers to take.
Yeah, I mean, some people do sign contracts, and some employers do list jobs with super included. I noted with amusement that Grattan Institute's job listings are super inclusive, but they have put out a lot of research saying that super doesn't bump pay rises. So I guess that's ideologically consistent for them.
Okay, so over that 30 years, just really quickly, we should go through a couple of other things that have changed and Phil and chip in if I'm missing anything here. These details are just not crucial to understanding the broader critique, which we'll get to in a moment. But over those 30 years, you've got John Howard introducing self-managed super funds. So these are smaller funds with about, I think, 6 members, something like that, which are overwhelmingly for small, wealthy people who like going over documents and Excel spreadsheets and making investing decisions, and use them to shelter their own tax and hoard shitloads of money. So there's been a proliferation of those self-managed super funds. Costello introduces these insane tax concessions so that basically you're not taxed on your money coming out of your super at the other end whatsoever, which is pretty insane. And we've had these series of freezes too. So the super guarantee has been frozen at multiple stages along the way. Howard did it. Abbott did it. We are currently 10.5%. We're going to get to 12 seems to be the way to go. I think it's Labor's policy to get to 12. Keating's original vision was get to 15% of your wage would go into super. That was his original vision. He's, I think, abandoned that. He says it's too late to get that to make sure the baby boomers have a sufficient retirement in his view. So that's the future. Probably going to go to 12% if the Labor Party has its way. There was also the contribution cap introduced, I believe, by the Morrison government at some point. Do you know much about this? Where it's up to $1.7 million, you get that tax-free sweetness coming out of it, and then after that you get taxed. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a limit to the total tax-free pool you can have, basically.
Right. Okay, but there's all this diddling. It is this incredible, very touchy political subject. If any party gives an indication they want to change anything about the the super very generous tax arrangements, they are pilloried. Boomers get very angry. They start writing letters to the editor. It's yeah, it's a spicy meatball, that's for sure. And it's become this totem of Australian politics that no one wants to change, even though, as we say, it sucks. So before we get into the various critiques, before we get to all the huge problems, is there anything good to be said about this system, would you say? Being totally fair, yeah, there must be a reason why it is popular with a bunch of people. What good things can be said about Australia's super system?
I mean, I think super has worked out extremely well for a certain class of people. If you're on Ozpol Twitter, you'll be familiar with the drip demographic, and sometimes unkindly referred to as retired teachers. And I think if you look at what's happened in the financial markets for someone in that demographic, super probably kicked in to coincide with their peak earning years, but also coincided with this once in a lifetime appreciation in asset prices. So as we know, since the 90s, house prices have skyrocketed, prices of stocks have skyrocketed and are at much higher levels. And so all the money they saved through super has done extremely well. And I think they do perceive of super as the sort of magic money that Keating provided them with, and so they're very thankful for this, and it has given them a good quality of life. So I think there's certainly people that have benefited from super, and I mean that's part of the problem. Many people do benefit, and that's why people are very defensive about any kind of change. The trouble is that for anyone maybe not in the top echelon of society socioeconomically, it doesn't work out so well. But it's certainly worked out very very well for a lot of people.
And I think, and again, going back to what we were saying before about how shit things were previously, which is across the board with the Accord reforms and the Hawke-Keating era, so much is sort of said, well, people were better off than they were before on this very particular measure. Whereas, yeah, left-wing critiques are normally more about, well, yeah, but think about how much better things could be, or what are the policy goals or the values, the leftist critique that you're bringing to this that sort of imagines a much better world, a fairer world, and a world in which, yeah, with expanded welfare state to provide people the security and dignity they deserve across the board. So we should say, maybe we just missed over this. So once you get the super guarantee, everybody has to have a super account. You have your own individual account with a super fund. You can choose whatever super fund you so wish. There are default funds, so these certain industry funds, which are funds that are managed by 50% union representatives, 50% bosses. They're known as the industry funds. They're the ones with the little signal and those fucking annoying ads. And then there's a whole market of super funds. Some of them are extremely fucking dodgy, as we learned about during the Royal Commission into the banking sector. Particularly for-profit funds are the ones that were ripping off their members across the board. But these funds become absolutely fucking massive. Something like Australian Super has 2 million members. It's got it's the biggest fund in Australia, chaired by Paul Keating's former chief of staff. And I don't like union bashing, but there is like this little like fucking coterie of union bureaucrats at the top of the super industry, which does make me feel a little bit queasy. And these are massive funds, massive investment funds. I think about something like half or 40% of all super gets invested into equity markets. So that's the stock market here in Australia and across the world, across international finance. And the idea is that these funds will take your money, they'll invest it in various different ways, get sweet returns to and added with compound interest will give you this sweet nest egg that you'll retire on. You can access your super when you're in your 60s, and then you can both get a nice, maybe partial pension and also get a sweet super account that you can draw from. So that's the general idea. And all those assets, as we've mentioned, are worth more than $3 trillion, set to hit $10 trillion by 2040. So let's go through this, Rob. How is super failing on its basic task of providing people with a comfortable retirement? We've mentioned the people that has worked out for, and good luck to them, and we're happy for you, etc. But give us the full picture of how super is failing, Australian retirees across the board.
I think a lot of the misunderstanding about how progressive super is driven by a myth that basically everybody works full-time most of their lives and all workers work about the same. And if that were true, super would be a pretty good system and everybody would wind up with a pretty decent balance by the time they hit retirement and all would be fine. But unfortunately, that's not the reality. So obviously people earn quite drastically different amounts in reality. We have people delivering food or driving Uber for, in practice, below minimum wage, all the way up to, say, CEOs like Alan Joyce at Qantas, earning millions and millions, and also in the middle, high-earning professionals like doctors and lawyers. And so there's a huge range of incomes out there, and also not everyone is a full-time worker. Some people are part-time, some people are unemployed, some people are sick, some people are caregivers, and people take breaks from the workforce to have children. And so,
well, that's their choice, Rob. That's them being selfish. Okay, why would they do that when they could increase their super balance? I mean, that's a choice that they have to make.
Very selfish to have children and perpetuate the human race. Yeah.
Yes.
That should be for only the upper classes.
Once your super balance gets to a certain level, then you're allowed to have a baby.
Yeah, you can go to the government, get your child having permit from your super fund.
Oh God, that's probably Keating's fucking vision for the whole system. Anyway, yes. So this idea that once you've got a retirement system tied to lifetime earnings, the inequalities of your working life are replicated in your retirement. Okay, so the horrors of the market, the reasons why we hate capitalism, and the way that the market exacerbates, creates, perpetuates all these inequalities in a variety of different ways. Well, guess what? That's now just being replicated in your retirement. So the rich have massive super funds, and as you say, if you've had a working life in which you were unemployed for a period of time, had a low-paid work, took time out to have a kid. Remember, super is not paid during paid parental leave, which is just also another crime. All that stuff gets replicated in retirement. And just run us through the stats there. What does that mean for a whole bunch of women and low-paid people, and actually how many people have super accounts and what their balances are looking like?
Yeah, so the stats are pretty dismal, really. If you look at the industry figures that the industry puts out every so often about what average balances are, it seems like the average person has balances in the several hundred thousand. But there's a problem with those stats in that they publish averages generally, not medians, which means that the very, very few 1% of people who have many millions stashed into their super accounts, they push up the average, even though their big accounts are of no benefit to the rest of us. And so the other problem is that their stats are only statistics on their members. So they go and look at all the accounts they have in their system and they add up the average balance. But of course, that excludes people with zero accounts that have been closed because they've been hit by fees and dwindled down to zero, and also people who have no super account at all, which is people who might have spent extended periods of time outside the labour market. And so the reality of who has what super is actually much, much worse than the statistics present or what one might intuitively expect. And so it turns out that if you look at over 65s, who you hope all have a healthy super balance to give them a comfortable retirement, that's simply not the case. And so more than half of retirees have absolutely no super. They might have spent what little they had, or for older ones, they might have worked most of their career before the super system was introduced, and so they've absolutely zero super. And it's only once you get into sort of the top 10% that you get up to substantial balances in the hundreds of thousands, the kind that the super industry tells you is what you need to live a comfortable retirement. And so the statistics are much worse than everybody realizes.
And what is it? The median balance for a man is like 100K and women's 36K?
Yeah, I think back in 2017, it's probably improved slightly since then, but not significantly. I think the median at retirement, like 60 to 65, something like 110 for men and just 36K for women. And then a lot of people, if they have smaller super balances, they'll take them out as a lump sum to maybe fix up some things around the house. When retirement hits, and that's their super gone. And so the Paul Keating's vision of how super is meant to work is you're meant to accumulate this enormous pool of assets, and it's meant to pay you this continuous stream of money, and you live a luxurious retirement. But that's really only the case for the top 10% of that. For other people, it's adding a little bit extra or none at all. And so it's really only benefiting the select few.
But hey, that's okay. If you run out of super, then you can just go onto Australia's pension, which, as we've mentioned, is awful. It's below the poverty line. Okay, so if you're on the full-time pension, you're living below the poverty line. And I've got a stat here from the National Seniors Australia. 1 in 4 Australian pensioners are living in poverty in this country, one of the richest countries in the world. 1 in 4 pensioners living in poverty. As we said, if you're single, particularly if you're a single woman and you don't own your house, poverty rates are something like 60% of the population. So that's what you're being chucked onto. And we'll get to the tax deductions in a bit. But of course, all the tax breaks that we're giving to the rich people to store their money in super could be spent, obviously, making a more generous, truly universal pension that would stop people living in fucking poverty. Your parents and your grandparents doing that, which seems like a better option. IMHO.
We talk a lot about the tax concessions when it comes to super, but I think there's a lot of people who labour under this misconception that superannuation is a good system, but we just need to tighten up the tax breaks and then it'll work fine and then it'll be fairer. But even if there was zero tax breaks, it would be much better if there was zero tax breaks, and that would be a great thing. But super still has this problem of what you talked about before, Tom, of replicating pre-retirement income inequality and duplicating it after retirement. And that's baked into the fundamental design of the system. And so one of the points I'm fond of mentioning is that super doesn't need reforming. It needs a change to the fundamental design, because if you think about the basics of what an effective retirement system does, is it guarantees that you won't be in poverty. Super is often called a retirement security system. Security to me implies that it should guarantee that no disasters will befall you and poverty won't hit you after retirement, but it doesn't do that because of this flawed design. The other element of a retirement security system, you would think, is risk pooling. So you don't know how long you're going to live into retirement. You might die 2 weeks into retirement. You might live until 110 and need 50 years of savings. You don't know. And so an effective retirement system should pool the risk. And we already have a pension that does this. Like if you live for 50 years, you get 50 years of pension. If you live for 2 weeks in retirement, you get 2 weeks of pension. And that's absolutely the way to solve that problem. So we already have a system that solves these problems, and what little pension there is working overtime to reduce poverty. But we have this much larger super system, which has got $3 trillion of wealth, but it's doing absolutely nothing towards achieving these progressive goals of poverty elimination, of inequality reduction, and of pooling risk. In fact, it's doing the opposite and making these things worse in most cases.
So obviously the universal pension is the ideal, but and maybe it's worth here just touching on the idea of a defined benefit contribution scheme, which I know sounds so boring again. And for the people who are still listening, fucking congrats to you. Great work. It's good. But this is a really crucial difference that like was a light bulb in my head. So super, these are accumulation funds, right? Which do what they sound. You accumulate a shitload of wealth that you then draw on in retirement, as opposed to a defined benefit or defined contribution schemes, which some super funds still do. And prior to the universal super guarantee, most funds were defined benefit schemes, as I understand it. You'll see lots of defined benefit schemes with government pensions. The idea is that you pay into the system over a period of time, and there's a formula worked out that pays you out a certain amount of money, maybe 70 or 80% of your income, maybe even more than that, for as long as you are alive. As you say, if you live 50 years into retirement, you get paid every single year because that's your right. That's the benefit that you get paid out, as opposed to an accumulation fund in which once the money runs out, then you're fucked, right?
That's right. And so it's this fundamental difference of individual interest versus collective interest. And the individualistic design of super just doesn't achieve any of these goals. And in fact, when you look at analysis of retirement systems in Australia, you find that the main effect of super is to help people who are high income and already wealthy to accumulate even more inheritances, which like the main effect of that is simply to make society even less fair in the long term and increase wealth inequality. So having really harmful effects there. And this is a key reason we need to move towards a more collective design to eliminate that.
Cool. Let's move through these other awful parts of super nice and quick. It's thieving our wages. The union movement often talks about wage theft. The Labor government talks about wage theft. Wage theft in the super system is really, really bad. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so because superannuation is paid separately to wages through a different mechanism, and because you're not paid it directly, and so you notice it less, superannuation non-payment is absolutely rife. And even though superannuation is only, roughly speaking, 10% of our total wage bill, it's responsible for, according to the estimates, about 80% of wage theft in Australia, because it's so much easier to get away with not paying it. And a lot of people, although certain people in the political class are obsessed with super and talk about it all the time and think about it all the time, the actual engagement from everyday people, particularly people who don't have much in super, is quite low. So people are not checking their super balance every day and seeing what's going on the way that they might check their bank balance. And so it's just easier to get away with not paying it. And this is why non-payment is so rife.
And that's across the board. I mean, you mentioned like people driving around in Ubers, and like with the insecure workforce right across the board, which, to the union movement's credit, it does make a lot of noise about and wants to fight against. And there are some proposed legislations that will, try to make work more secure. Thanks, after fucking decades of neoliberalism that's made us all into independent contractors and self-employed stuff. And I suppose you would also describe the $30 billion a year in super fees that we pay is also a form of wage theft, right?
Well, that's right. And so this is an enormous amount of money that gets paid in super fees per year. The problem with the way super funds are structured is simply that there's so many of them. And so there's each of these funds has to employ the same people and do roughly the same things. Even though most super funds are roughly invested the same way and in the same stuff, basically the only responsible way to invest retirement savings is to invest in the things that super funds do, like property and shares. And so they're all kind of doing the same thing, but because there's hundreds of super funds, this effort is duplicated over and over again. So it's an enormous inefficiency. It's also a very highly paid sector of the workforce. It's full of fund managers and chief wellness officers or whatever, earning $500,000 a year, and all that stuff is coming out of people's wages. And, $30 billion a year is an enormous amount of money. I think if you compare it to the size of the military budget, Australia spends like 2% of its entire GDP on the military. The military employs about, I think, 50 to 60,000 people, and superannuation is approaching that size. I think there's 50,000 or so people employed in the superannuation industry, and that money really is just going down the drain. It's coming out of everyone's wages and employing people to duplicate effort and do things in a very inefficient way. If you look overseas for ways that we could be avoiding these fees, obviously some level of fees is appropriate because the money does take some management, but the fact is these fees could be substantially lower. Norway's sovereign wealth fund, for instance, is $1 trillion in size and manages to have fees about per dollar invested about 20 times lower than Australia's system. So we could simply do the same thing by fixing super, changing it into a collective system and getting rid of all that duplicated effort, drastically lowering fees and putting wages back in people's pockets. And that's just, that's 2% of GDP that we're throwing down the drain and could be going into workers' wages or going to almost anything else that would be more productive, really.
But competition, Rob. See, we need all these funds to compete against each other, and that will create innovation, and they'll compete against each other, and everyone will spend their Friday nights checking out all the super fees and being like, oh, I can get a better deal over here with this super fund, so I'm going to switch all my super money over there. That's how the system works.
It does amaze me that if you read the Financial Review or whatever, people spend so much time talking about how can we boost productivity in Australia? How can we wring a couple more points of GDP? And super fees are just absolutely sitting right over here. It's money literally being poured down the toilet, but no one really seems to talk about it. So it's as much as the military budget. It's as much as I think it's more than Australian households spend on electricity each year. So just a vast amount of money. It's eye-watering to think about. I mean, the quantities involved in the super system are just numbers almost too big to comprehend. It's
very hard to, yeah.
Yeah, this is why we ought to think about it a lot more, because the scale of it is such that it could do incredible things. I think you mentioned before it could buy up the entire ASX. it's vast amounts of money and vast amounts of potential that are being squandered in terms of using that money to make a better society.
Yes, but of course that would never happen because that would require all the super funds getting together and doing something collectively with workers' collective retirement savings. But they're not. They're competing against each other. This is a market that has been created. Again, Keating's neoliberal mind and the introduction of markets into every single facet of life, and markets always produce the best results, but it's also a fake market. I think this is why conservatives really fucking hate it, because if you're legislated to get all this money, right, so workers have to pay this money to this industry in some way, so that there is these kind of golden rivers of money no matter what. Now, some super funds get closed down and there's more regulation being introduced, which means if you're an underperforming fund, you're probably going to get fucked over, and you will probably – so like the idea of – regulation to create the competition that will shut out the worst competitors, I suppose. But for the massive big funds, it's just like they're guaranteed shitloads of money from workers' retirement savings. That's the law. Like they just have to have all these incomes, coming towards them. So again, it's a highly constructed market that just delivers huge amounts of money to individual funds who, do perform very well. As you say, the returns on some of these accounts and their investment decisions are massive because they're gigantic capital funds that you would actually have to work pretty hard at to suck at, to be honest. But that kind of false market that's played out in the super industry is mind-blowing, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that it was set up as what was meant to be this thriving market, and it turns out that all the smaller funds have basically underperformed, and they've had to shut them down, and then everything is just gradually merging back into one super fund anyway, and it sort of makes you think, why didn't we do that 30 years ago and just set it up as one big fund? Yeah,
Keating and Kelty say, there'll probably be just 10 mega funds with $500 billion each. That's sort of where it's all going to end up. It's like, cool, bro. Let's have one. Yeah,
exactly. That's the end goal. And at the time when Keating and Kelty were setting this up, it was floated that there ought to be a public superannuation option.
Yes.
One big fund to run everyone's retirement savings. There was a review done called the Hancock Review that suggested this, but Keating and Kelty hated that idea. They thought it was too close to Marxism, and so shut it down and created this monstrous privatized alternative instead.
Fucking psychos. All right. We've already touched on the fact that, of course, it lowers your spending ability during your working life. You've got 10% of your wage going out. That's money. That is your money, but you have to defer it until retirement. You could be spending that money now. Now, this is where people might get a little bit worried because, it sounds like maybe we think that Tim Wilson and his campaign of Home First, Super Second is correct. And you have a section on your website, Workers Against Super, which we'll talk about more in a little bit, that sort of explicitly says, no, we fucking hate these guys. This campaign is against Tim Wilson and Andrew Bragg. We don't like them. But is it fair to say that on some level, the points that Tim Wilson was making in his campaign, which says that confiscating workers' wages, such a big chunk of workers' wages for retirement when they could use that money now in their working lives, is a fairly decent idea and a good point?
There is something to it. There's evidence from economist Cameron Murray. He put together some work a while back, and it shows that for the bottom 40% of workers, super actually achieves the opposite of what it's intended to, right? So what the assumption is built into super is this idea of life cycle income smoothing. So ostensibly your income is higher during your working life and low in retirement. But for the bottom 40% of workers, the pension is actually a pay rise because they were on during their working life, they were on very low or sporadic wages. And so what super winds up doing is actually making them poorer when they were relatively poorer anyway, and giving them more in retirement, but they actually would have been better off in retirement anyway. And so super's not doing this, particularly for people on the low end. It's not doing this very good job of smoothing consumption over your life. Obviously, the goal is to have a fairly even consumption or standard of living throughout your life. So super's actually making this goal worse, not better. And so there does seem to be some merit in simply letting people withdraw from their super accounts. A lot of the stuff you hear from the Labor Party is like when there's been these schemes to withdraw emergency money from super, they say, it's horrible that people are expected to raid their retirement savings for emergency funds. But the opposite is also true, right? Like super is raiding the money you might need for emergencies and putting it towards your pension in retirement, which you might not even need. You might die before retirement, and so it's a terrible trade-off either way. With one choice, you're asking for poverty in the future, but with the other choice, with super, you're getting more poverty now. And so I think it would be a bit better if people actually need money, they should simply be able to withdraw it from their super and spend it now and alleviate poverty now, because that's the most immediate concern. And then further down the track, being highly optimistic here, hopefully, in 30 years' time, when those people who needed emergency funds are retiring, they won't be harmed in retirement because we have a better pension system. So if they haven't accumulated enough savings by then, they'll be okay in retirement. And so we should favour immediate poverty relief now. And the other thing you hear from Andrew Bragg and Tim Wilson is this home first, super second idea, where people should be allowed to withdraw from their super for a home deposit. A lot of people think this is a bad idea, and the reason for that is they think it will inflate the housing market even more. But Grattan Institute actually analysed this plan and found that the concern about super withdrawals inflating the housing market are overrated, because the people in situations who would need to be withdrawing their super have no super anyway. So in fact, it probably wouldn't push up the housing market, because most people who don't have the money to afford a house don't have the income to have accumulated much super either. So it's all a little bit academic. And so it seems to me that we should simply allow people to withdraw what they need and then fix super down the track and make sure they don't wind up in poverty further along.
Yeah.
There already is a scheme for people in serious hardship who can apply to withdraw their super early and use that money, but it's a very onerous process and quite humiliating to go through and takes time. It seems like it's an option that should be available for more people. It's people's own wages, and they should be able to prioritise appropriately.
Yeah,
I think a lot of the talk about super, there's this kind of paternalistic notion that poor people need to be forced to save because they're too irresponsible to save, but I don't think that's true. I think people spend money because they need to. In my own life, when I haven't been earning much, I haven't saved much, and when I have been earning more, I've saved more. So I think people know how to save. I think people just don't have the incomes a lot of the time to be able to put money aside. So the solution is not to force people to save. The solution is to boost equality and boost incomes.
I think the point that Cameron Murray makes too is that you are expending more in your 20s and 30s, and when you're raising kids and you're trying to buy a house, that's when you want as much money as possible. Your actual expenditure is a lot lower in retirement, is the idea. So it is weird to sort of take money from here, and even if you take 10 grand out now, and that could become way more money by the time you get to future, thanks to capital accumulation through the funds. It might actually be more valuable from just a personal point of view to have that money now to live your life the way you want to live it during your working life when you're raising a young family or whatever, than it is to, not have as many nice things in retirement necessarily. So that's that sort of trade-off. What I think we should definitely say when it comes to liberal, the problem with Tim Wilson's argument too is that the Liberals aren't interested in growing wages. Okay, so it's you should be very suspicious of someone from the Liberal Party saying, no, this is how we get wages going. We want to put more money in workers' pockets. And our solution to that is to, take it from this super fund, which for different reasons we could agree with. But broadly speaking, it's just the Liberals are the party of wage suppression. They've gone to war with organised labour. They do not care about wages growing, in a decent way and workers getting a fair share. They're very happy to see the capital share of income increase and wages go down. So, just because broken clock, is right twice a day kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's right. They're certainly badly motivated, and their interest seems to just be to reduce wage bills for employers and allow them to get away with paying less. And I don't think that's what we should do at all. It's fine super is essentially a payroll tax on employers, and it's fine to have payroll taxes on employers and raise them. But the problem with what's happening with that money with super is that it's all going towards people who are already wealthy and enriching them. We should be taking that slice of the economy and all that money that's grown to over $3 trillion and doing something better with that money. That's that's a transformative amount of money that could potentially turn Australia into one of the most equal countries on the planet. And it's just not doing that. So squandered opportunity.
We'll get to that in a sec. And I know that we'll go. Look, I figure that we can go long in this app because I feel like if people have come this far, then they're fucking into this. It's right up their jacksie. So let's keep going. The point we should make too is that, of course, once you put your retirement savings into the market, into the wonders of the stock market, guess what? The stock market can fuck you over, and the risk goes to you as an individual. You were talking about sharing risk before. Well, if you have an individual super account and the investments turn bad, that's on you, bitch. There's no guarantee from super that things are going to work out fine. And we saw that in the wake of the GFC. Australia's pension system was the second hardest hit in the world. 21% of the superannuation savings pool was wiped out. It's about $270 billion. And you might have heard stories of people who experienced that, who were about to retire, who, overnight basically just saw a bunch of their retirement savings gone. A lot of people had to go back to work, pushed a lot of people into real precarity. They had all these plans for their retirement based on their super balance, and then it's all wiped out. Same thing happened at the start of COVID, although probably a lot of pension, superannuations have bounced back after the stock market went batshit in the years over the pandemic for insane capital reasons. But that's a very important point to make with our supermarket is that there is substantial risk when a whole bunch of your savings are tied up with the vagaries of the market, right?
That's right. There's enormous timing risk, and there's the additional problem that often this money that you've invested in your super is being invested in companies which are actively opposed to your interests, right? So you might stick $1,000 into super, and then that super fund goes and invests that money into private equity, and then that company buys up your employer and decides to slash staff, and you get fired. So essentially, you're funding the undermining of your own conditions.
Yes.
There's a guy in the United States, David Weber, who writes about this issue and thinks that pension funds should have a wider remit where they're forced to consider overall worker well-being and not just the raw financial returns from their retirement savings, but think about their overall financial well-being and their working conditions. So it would be their duty as fund managers to invest in companies that actually respect their workers, pay decent wages, and have decent working conditions.
Yeah, it's amazing. You get the risk to the individual if things go badly, and the risk to society if things go well. Even we have super funds invested in Amazon, in Uber, in weapons manufacturers, in companies that run detention centers. Some workers' retirements are reliant on the success and the flourishing of companies that fuck over workers, as you say. It's insane. And this is what Keating did. He enraptured the entire retirement savings pool, the idea of guaranteeing a decent retirement for Australian workers, just enmeshed it completely, almost inextricably at this point, into the capitalist machine and to markets. And of course he did, because he's certainly no socialist. He's no great critique of capitalism necessarily. He's social democrat, economic liberal, really. Certainly liberalised the Australian economy, but believes in this magical power of markets to solve all these problems, and isn't really interested in massively shifting power in that way, but just thinks, well, no, we can just save up all this shitloads of money, subject it to market logics, and that'll produce better outcomes for everyone.
Yeah, it's bizarre to see a company like Qantas, and a lot of people in the union movement and Labor Party hate Qantas and think it's an enemy of good working conditions, and then the next minute you see super funds, particularly industry super funds, which are in part governed by unions, and they're almost certainly invested in Qantas themselves. So on one hand, on one hand they're enemies, but on one hand they're literally the owners of the same company, and I don't think people are conscious of that sometimes.
Yeah. All right. Sorry, really quickly, got to move through some other stuff. So it costs way more. So these massive super concessions, or the tax concessions rather, $41 billion a year. Your website says that it currently costs more than the age pension now. Is that right? Or we're on track to overtake the foregone revenue in super concessions is going to overtake the cost of running the age pension in the coming years, or are we there already?
Yeah, I think we're approaching it. I think the age pension costs something like $50 billion a year. The tax concessions cost around $40 billion a year. And the tax concessions only wind up saving around $9 billion in pension costs because they means some people in the middle get means tested a little more. So we're spending all this money on tax concessions and not saving any government budget. I mean, if you listen to Keating and Jim Chalmers and other folks like that, they're always talking about how it's this budget saver and it takes pressure off the government finances. Absolutely, the opposite is true. It's a sinkhole in the budget.
Yeah, and again, through self-managed super funds, through various systems, taking advantage of the concessional taxation of super. People are using this as tax shelters, as estate planning. There are people under 30 with super balances of $2 million, which you kind of go, hang on, what? How did that work? I wonder where that money came from, and I wonder how that's
obviously
going for you.
Very, very hard indeed.
Yeah, just super hard. It's really, really hard. I mean, I guess there are some billionaires under 30 now, so I guess they might be doing okay. But I wonder if they have big super accounts. But, regular reports that there is a super fund with $544 million in it, in a self-managed super fund. So you go, okay, this is not retirement whatsoever. This is a place to stash a shitload of cash that gets taxed at 15% and gets treated extremely well, and then only grows, and that wealth is just hoarded and not redistributed to other people to make our society better. It's incredible, like the levels of tax sheltering that is going on is pretty remarkable. So that's how it fucks over individual people with super accounts. It fucks over the government and the state, I suppose, and doesn't achieve those same kind of goals that we were told about. But also, I mean, so the social implications for this, and really I think at the heart of this is the privatization of a pension system. The idea that, who should pay for people's retirement in this country? Should it be society? Should we do that collectively to look after everybody? Is that just one of the most basic things that we should do as a society, is provide a decent retirement to every single person once they leave the workforce because they're fucking human beings? Or should it be more about self-provision, which is what Keating was talking about? Okay. And I think the most revealing quote to me is this is from 2014. This is Paul Keating writing the ABC. So 2014, you've got Joe Hockey as the treasurer. You've got the Abbott government in place. They're bringing down the 2014 budget, which everyone despised. They tried to inflict austerity on the Australian people.
The age of entitlement is over.
And Paul Keating wrote this. The treasurer talks of ending the age of entitlement. I gave substance to that notion 30 years ago when I asked Australians to provide for their own retirement, to move beyond reliance on the age pension as the default anti-destitution measure. Okay? So this is where he's at. He's like, fuck you, Joe Hockey. I was doing austerity way before you, and I was hacking away at social solidarity back in the 90s, way before it was cool. I don't believe that the pension or a decent retirement is something that people should be entitled to. It should be entirely up to people's own self-provision and the forces of the market to guarantee that. And then the implications of that is, again, just the hacking away of social solidarity, undermining what people expect from the state and from society and what they deserve. And the Retirement Income Review that was released in 2020 found that surveys show less than half of the Australian population and just 30% of people aged under 55 believe that the age pension will still exist when they reach retirement. Okay, so people think, clearly, it's the age pension is being pushed up. Clearly, we're privatizing this whole bad boy. We are looking for a future in which, no one's going to have my back. I'm terrified of retirement, so I'm just going to hoard as much cash as humanly possible, whack it into my super. And the result of that is that many people don't even spend it. They don't even touch the capital on their super, and they die with these massive balances that they've never actually drawn on, which then just becomes an inheritance for their kids, which then exacerbates wealth inequality. Discuss. I'm sorry. I know that was a big rant, but I just that just makes me so angry and sad.
I mean, there's a lot of points to cover there, but first of all, I think we need to tackle this myth that there's like two classes of retirees, where there's the government dependent ones, and then there's the self-funded retirees. And while that might be true from an accounting perspective, basically the way the economy works is that no matter how your retirement is funded, working age people support retirement age people. If a retiree goes to a restaurant and eats a dinner, they consume from current production. They consume food that was grown this year, people who were staffed on that day. They took up space in a restaurant that was rented that month. They are not, living off grain that's been stored in a silo somewhere. They are consuming current economic resources, and that's true whether they're, paying for that restaurant meal with their pension or whether they're paying from their investment returns. And so there's no way out of the fact that society has to support retirees, and we simply have to decide how to do that. There's plenty of money to go around, and so the notion that retirees should be thought of as a burden is totally wrong. We can easily support retirees in Australia as much as we want to. Australia is a very rich, high GDP country overall, and so there's plenty of resources there to do that. And so the idea that there's this crisis and we won't be able to afford the pension anymore. We just talked about how tax concessions alone cost more than the entire pension. The cost of the pension is going to be very manageable over time. If you look at a country like New Zealand, they're quite a substantially poorer country than Australia, but managed to pay a universal pension at about the same level. So pension costs are not a problem, and it's this huge bogeyman that the aging population is going to mean that we run out of money. And even if it did, superannuation wouldn't help anyway, because savings are just numbers in an account, and we need an economy that can support the retirees that currently exist, no matter what savings they have, and there's no way around that.
Yeah, again, it's like, if super accounts were like, buying up private aged care homes and providing incredible aged care services at a cheap rate for the working class and guaranteeing people a decent retirement throughout, or a decent and a chance to live in aged care homes with the dignity they deserve, you might go, okay, I guess super is transforming the way that retirement works in this country, but they're not, because there aren't sweet good returns on those aged care homes necessarily, or at least running them in a decent way that they deserve. So we're not going to do that. We're probably just going to invest in Lockheed Martin.
Exactly. So if we really cared about preparing for an aging population, we would do things like upgrade the housing stock, invest in public services for aged care, make sure our health system was ready, and train more doctors and nurses, and do all those things that actually get things ready in real terms. But just accumulating more money in a savings account doesn't really tackle the fundamental problem. And in fact, if you have an unequal system like super, where you have a whole bunch of retirees living absolutely lavish, that simply increases the burden, because they're consuming more resources. If they're if these rich retirees are buying up massive houses that they don't need, that's more housing stock that working age people can't live in. And in fact, we already have a sort of bizarre situation from an urban planning sense, where the wealthier, leafy inner suburbs are occupied by boomer retirees, whereas the people who need to live close to the city, the people working get pushed out further into the suburbs. And so we really just don't plan things well in terms of allocating resources where they're actually needed to support a aging population and the working age population either.
Speaking of both housing and the idea of the social responsibility and possibilities of super, I mean, that was in the news this week when we heard about this plan from the federal government to put a whole bunch of money up to entice superannuation funds to invest in social and affordable housing. And we should say that this is part of the vision too, right? So maybe some more lefty socialistic members of the union movement initially sort of viewed these super funds as a real way to democratize the economy and to have these worker representative funds that would do socially good things for people. So they might provide cheap home loans, they'd build social housing, and they would do good things for workers across the board. Well, that's not how it's turned out, because they've just become capital funds operating under capitalism in the market, and they have a fiduciary responsibility to just get as big a returns as possible for their members to increase the accumulation funds. So that's their mission. So it's just make shitloads of money. So that's why they invest in all those horrible companies that we mentioned before, including fossil fuel companies as well, of course. So cooking the planet for people to come, for generations to come. So keep that in mind. But in this case, the government is having to put up $575 million to underwrite the returns that super funds would need to get in order to make it worth their while to invest in social and affordable housing. Okay, so now these super funds aren't guided by any ethical mission to make society better. They need to know that the public is going to put up shitloads of money to make sure they get the correct return, so that they can pay out their members and make sure their accounts go up to make sure that the returns are there and they abide by their fiduciary responsibility. So again, once you turn them into just giant capital funds, they're just like giant capital funds like any other, really, aren't they?
Yeah, and they've taken this role now where they undermine real public ownership. And so you have super funds like Transurban, for instance, which owns all the toll roads. Their largest shareholder is Australian Super. And these super funds are buying up. So they're buying up housing, they're buying up cell phone towers, they're buying up airports, all the kinds of things that you'd think, that should probably be under public ownership. And there's this myth that kind of gets perpetuated by people in the union movement, where it's like, this is funds for social good that are investing in this stuff. But if you think about it, it's very much inferior to actually having publicly owned systems, because if a public asset gets returned, that money flows back into the into public ownership to hopefully benefit everyone equally. But these returns from toll roads, Australian Super is just sitting there clipping the ticket, but that money doesn't flow evenly to benefit society. It's flowing to the to the top 1% and the top 10%, and giving nothing to everyone else. And so it's this kind of alternative form of ownership that's crowding out public ownership, but expected to, because we have such a hollowed out public sector and public capability, expected to take on all these social duties, which a system like that really can't, because the right place to do these things is at a government level. But Super's just had this role of undermining not only the pension system, but the public sector as a whole.
And it's like governments can build something and it can just exist, right? Super funds, if they directly build stuff, they need to get a return. So, it makes no difference from a commuter's point of view if you're paying a toll to Transurban or to a fucking directly to a super fund. It doesn't matter, right? There's still a giant fund trying to extract capital and profit from using the thing that they build. So it doesn't make much sense to me. But yeah, look, super funds are saying they're very wary of the risk of investing in social and affordable housing because, they need to get those sweet returns. So it's like, public good, not so much. We need to get that sweet cash back, which is very frustrating and very annoying that the government seems to think their only option here is to just is to get the super funds to help them out, which is bizarre.
It just seems like very, very weak stuff from Jim Chalmers and Paul Keating to be essentially begging these funds to build public housing. It's like why don't you do it? You're in charge. You're in charge.
You're the treasurer, mate. Or stop giving them so many tax concessions and then collect more money and use that.
Don't you deserve better than the best? Who should handle all your dirty jobs? Someone else!
Okay, so alternatives that we talked about, and we really touched on them throughout. Obviously, the dream is a universal, generous old age pension. That is the situation in New Zealand, is that right?
I wouldn't necessarily call it generous. Like, it's probably at about the same level here, where a lot of people get by on it, but it's universal. So you hit the age group, and there's no asset test or anything. You just get the pension, and that makes things work just a lot cleaner. A large part of the financial planning industry is built around gaming the superannuation system, gaming those tax concessions, but also gaming the pension means test. So, for instance, if you put a whole lot of money, into buying a big house, expensive house before retirement, and then you have less savings, then you can go and cry poor, even though you live in a big fancy house, and get more pension. Whereas someone who doesn't have a house but has some savings because the primary residence is exempted, will get less pension, even though they're objectively in a much poorer situation. So all sorts of bizarre unintended consequences from the means testing, which just really makes it a poorly designed system. And so the more appropriate way to do that is just pay everyone a pension, pay everyone more pension, and as a way to fund that, raise taxes on upper income people, and in particular scrap the tax concessions from superannuation, which are really just a total giveaway to the people who need it least.
Mm. And universality is so crazy because Labor people say, oh, you can't, we shouldn't give these generous pensions to millionaires. You go, well, that's the whole point of Medicare, isn't it? Like, they love banging on about the universality of Medicare, and Medicare's got a lot of problems as well. But it's like, universality gives across the board buy-in. It's more social solidarity. Rich people pay more taxes through the tax system, which then funds the same thing that they benefit from. And yes, this endless means testing hacks away that social solidarity, reduces what people expect they deserve from the state, and is often very expensive to enforce means testing. And as you say, sets up these whole industries based on how to get around them, like in the financial planning sector. But but if we're going to have these pension funds, it'd be way better to have one big public option, a cheap option, a big pension fund like Norway, the model that Keating specifically rejected. Lower fees, giant pool, benefits everybody, and has slightly more democratic accountability, I suppose. I mean, we have the Future Fund in Australia, which is invested in like nuclear weapons and horrible shit. It's chaired by Peter Costello, so it's not a panacea. You can also have very bad publicly owned giant funds that are doing bad shit. But that is a much preferable model, right?
Yeah, so obviously you can still do bad things with public ownership. You can still do bad things with socialism. Bad things can still happen, but it's nonetheless a worthy goal to push towards a more publicly owned, more collectively owned system, right? So when you look at the Norway Fund is initially it was started from oil revenue, but it now is invested throughout the overall economy. It takes the role in Norwegian society as this collective pool of wealth, but it's much better than super because it's genuinely collectively owned. And yes, we do have an equivalent in the form of the Future Fund, but the Future Fund is much smaller. And the Norwegian Fund differs in that it's explicitly about common ownership for all Norwegians. So very much aimed explicitly at shared wealth and public ownership, whereas the Future Fund, I don't think Peter Costello would like it if you described it that way. It's more about just meeting some pension obligations and there's not much more to it than that. So that's how I would fix superannuation in Australia. I would transition all the money that flows into individual accounts and start redirecting that towards one big pool of shared wealth. So the size of the wealth that we could build, if superannuation had been a public system all along and collectively owned all along, we would now have, this $3 trillion pool would be an incredibly large pool of public ownership. It would own most of the stock market. And the Norwegian Fund, for instance, owns about 75% of the non-housing capital or wealth in Norway. And we in Australia would probably have even more than that if super had been public all along. And so, the best time to do that was 30 years ago, but second best time to do that is now. And we should start redirecting money into one big public fund and growing it and using it to pay universal benefits, universal pensions, and start tackling inequality.
Finally, I got to ask about the old Greensy. The Greens, again, as I say, I don't hear them talking about super that much. It's sort of Labor's big bugbear or the coalition's enemy. I had a look at the policy on economic justice. The Greens are for reforms to the taxation of superannuation to benefit lower income earners, reform of the superannuation system for greater public investment options, fairer rates of taxation, ethical investment structures, providing more equitable retirement incomes, particularly for women and other disadvantaged groups. Another part of Greens history is back in 2015 when Richard Di Natale was the leader, and Labor hacks will often bring this up as the illustration of the Greens being tree Tories, hands down. They did vote with the Turnbull government to further means test the age pension. Okay, so which, as we've mentioned, I would argue was a bad idea. They were arguing at the time this was undoing a very generous change under the Howard government, which in their view meant that, very wealthy people were getting a certain pension benefit. Now, universality is good. That means testing is really bad, so it's weird. They also argued that in the trade-off of that, they got the coalition government was said they were going to put the tax concessions of super back on the table and they might get a retirement income review. I don't know if much came of that, whether that was actually the review that we ended up getting in 2020 or what have you, but I think it's a good example of, on reflection, of a Greens vote that was pretty bad and buys into the idea that the pension should only go to people in a certain age bracket and assets should discount you from receiving a universal age pension. But I suppose, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that and what you would like to see the Greens fighting for, politically, how they could go about bringing out the changes to the super system that you're thinking of. Yeah,
I think the Greens, obviously one of the fundamental struggles for the Greens is they're often dismissed as a little bit utopian, and that's just the nature of being a minor party. And so I think it's important for the Greens to pick policies which are grounded in realism and in pragmatism. And so I think the concept of a social wealth fund fits into that well. It's something that we already have in the form of the Future Fund. The idea of scaling that up is a pretty easy one to sell. Like, it doesn't require a great imagination for the public to understand what that would look like. It would make sense to everyone. But if it was successfully implemented and carried out and made much larger, and super contributions were directed towards such a fund, it would be quite a radical step towards a more democratically owned society, a more equal society in Australia. So it's the kind of thing. Where they could really build a great vision around it, and while maintaining that economic kind of seriousness that the media really wants. So. I would love to see the Greens get behind a social wealth fund idea. It would be pretty good bang for buck in terms of tackling the fundamental problem that we have in Australia, which is this vast gulf of inequality that's tearing society apart.
It is neoliberalism. I think this is the point to come back to. Like, the super system is a neoliberal reform. It individualizes things. It hacks away at social solidarity. It's a version of privatizing the pension system. It's putting workers' retirement, subjecting that to market logics, and putting our collective retirement fate in the hands of the market. And that's bad. And there's all this space to the left of Labor. Labor, every member of Labor just spends all their time defending the super system constantly and celebrating it. And there is extraordinary space for leftists to point this out, that this is not the incredible social democratic panacea that people think it is, and that it really should be critiqued. And life in this country could be so much better, so much fairer, more equal if there were, if we looked at this system seriously and reconsidered it. Workersagainstsuper.org is the website that you have launched. This is a campaign. This is you and other workers getting together to try and popularize these ideas and spread them around, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So it really does seem like there's a real Overton window, like a narrow Overton window around super, where you're either on the left and you're a Keating stan, or you're on the right and you want to undermine it. But there's a huge space out to the left of that where we can do something much better with that $3 trillion than tax concessions and more inequality, and a whole lot of potential there. I've described how super's a bad system in many ways, but it's a system that within it there's this granule of potential for creating more equality, fixing the problems, and building collective wealth and more public ownership. So that's the space that I'm trying to open up by launching this website and campaigning for a more progressive perspective on superannuation.
Workersagainstsuper.org, check it out, read Rob's piece at Jacobin, or go to djrobstep.com as well to check out his other work, at djrobstep on Twitter. Thanks so much, man. I've loved it. If there's anybody left listening, then fucking amazing. And it was really great to go into the detail there and lay that case out. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. We've really dived deep. It's been fun.
Hey, this is the kind of boring bonus content that you get as a patron of Serious Danger. Email us anytime, hello@seriousdangerpod.com. Follow us on social media at SeriousDangerAU, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. Like and subscribe and share the show. Thanks for supporting us, everyone. Bye.
Serious Danger Australia.